adoption can be a place where a child can get some stability and some love, but it doesn't mean that their families of origin didn't love them. It doesn't mean that they weren't loved in their communities. And especially when race is involved and there's a transracial or transnational adoption that happens, I think people don't realize the extent to the losses that occur.
Mm.
So for one thing, stop just using adoption as a joke or saying things like, oh, that person is so great. I wish they would adopt me and things like that, because it really diminishes that sense of loss. And the other thing I want listeners to take away is that those of us with lived experience in our communities are experts in our experience, and that we should be treated as such and validated for what we can contribute. And that doesn't mean that you have to have a PhD to do that.
This is Social Justice Origin Stories. I'm your host, Rolando Tompkins Jones. Social Justice Origin Stories is a storytelling project that highlights personal stories and defining moments that have inspired individuals and organizations to labor for equity and social justice. Through truth-telling, the honest sharing of their experiences, storytellers teach us about themselves, enabling us to learn about ourselves and our world through their stories. By reconnecting with pivotal moments of activation in their lives, they invite us to do the same. At Social Justice Origin Stories, we believe that there's power in storytelling and lived experience is experience. There's room enough for all of us to do this work. There are many ways to contribute, and our contributions don't need to be the same. We can enter and remain engaged in the work using the gifts that are special to us while supporting others and using theirs. We have the capacity to grow and change for the better when exposed to new information and experiences. We believe in our inherent worth and capabilities, and we possess the power to inspire and create change within ourselves and others. We can transcend the confines of the status quo to imagine and design more equitable and humanizing systems. So thank you all for joining us today. So today, I'm really happy to be joined by our guest, JaeRan Kim. And one of the things I'll share, and by this time in the progress of this project, you all would have heard the storytelling around how this came to be, but I'll just name it was the exercise of even inviting people for the first season of this project to come and share their stories was me looking back over the course of my own life for those folks who have inspired me, who have poured into me in different ways, people that I also admire and care for. And JaeRan was around when I first started posting things online many years ago, even when I crafted my own website and all of that, just seeing the wonderful things that she was doing gave me such inspiration to put a lot of what I've done together. So I'm really happy we followed one another over the years, but this is actually our first time actually meeting and speaking in person, and it's just a wonderful thing. So I really appreciate you being here. Thank you so much for coming to share with us.
Yeah, thank you, Rolando. I'm thrilled to be here. Actually, when you sent the invitation, I was like, of course, I'm going to do it, because I feel like we've known each other, even though, like you said, this is the first time we're meeting in person and talking to each other. But I feel like we've been following each other on our blogs and now on social media for a long enough time that it just feels like we already had a relationship. I feel in a way like we're talking just as friends. So a little bit about me. I'm JaeRan Kim. I'm currently working as an associate professor in social work at University of Washington, Tacoma. And I've been out here for the past almost 9 years, which is hard to believe. But before that, I was working as a social worker and being in community in Minnesota. And so I just have to say it's been interesting to see Minnesota on the political stage right now, too. And having grown up there, I was following George Floyd and all these things that were happening around COVID, and the governor who is now the pick for the vice president. And I have such a long-standing, deeply loved community there that it's been really interesting to follow it through this whole time. But I describe myself as a writer, as a scholar, as a late bloomer in a lot of ways.
Mm,
We were talking beforehand about trajectories and how people get to where they're at, and how we look at other people and we think, oh, they're doing all this great work. Maybe can I ever do that? And I want to normalize that. For me, it took many years to get to where I'm at now. And it was a long, winding road.
yes, yes.
And blogging and just being in community was what helped me get there. or get here, I should say. And I feel like I'm just still in the middle of trying to figure it out. So who knows where I'm going to be. I didn't start out being an academic or being academically inclined at all. When I was in high school, I described myself as a mediocre student. I have very creative part to me. And so I followed more of the creative parts. And somehow through teachers and through community members, I was encouraged to pursue academics and to pursue social work. And so that's what really got me started in a lot of this work. But I
Mhm.
never thought I would be here. I wasn't one of those students in high school or teachers were saying, you're going to do a PhD someday.
Yeah.
That wouldn't have been me. That was not me at all.
Mhm. I love how you shared it was a winding road as well, because I think about that. I also wasn't one of those students who, had the 10-year plan all mapped out. It's a lot of different things. This is a little bit of an aside, but I'm wondering when you said you had your creative parts in it, I'm wondering something that had come to me recently was this language around being a multi-potentialite. I don't know if you've heard of that at all,
Mm,
but
I,
okay,
I love it.
it is a little bit of an aside, but this idea of folks being talented and drawn to many different things, and it's really an affirmation and inspiring folks to pursue those varied interests in a society that can send messages that make us feel like we have to just be in one particular path. So I'll forward some of that, and I'll put some links to this talk that I'm thinking about in the episode notes too. But yeah, thank you, and I'm so happy that you're here. Thank you.
Thank
So,
you.
as you've been reflecting on your own social justice origin stories, some of those stories involve thinking about your experience as a transracial and transnational adoptee.
I was adopted from Korea in 1971. I was almost 3 years old, and I was adopted to a conservative white middle class family in the suburbs of Minneapolis. And it was a fairly small community that I was raised in. It was very predominantly white. I joke sometimes that I think there were more Black students in my school district than there were Asian students, but that's not saying much. The bar was really low.
Mm,
So I grew up with almost no diversity. I was the diversity, not just in my community and my church and my school, but in my family too. So I'm the only person that's adopted in my family. I have two siblings who are younger than me. So the only Asian person in a white family. And what that meant for me was that I grew up in complete isolation. I didn't know anything about being Korean, much less being Asian. And it took me until I was in college to really start to confront and grapple my racial and ethnic identity. And a large part of that was because I had the freedom to do so once I was in college and wasn't surrounded by, I was still predominantly white spaces. Don't get me
mhm.
wrong, I lived in Minnesota,
Oh,
but without my family around, I had the freedom to start exploring a little bit more. And so a lot of my work that I do now is around transracial adoption. And one of the things that I want to try and help other people understand outside of our community of transracial adoptees is that it's so hard for transracial adoptees who have white parents and white families to even feel like they have the permission
mm,
to start exploring their racial identity in any kind of a meaningful way because it's inherently set up to make us feel like we're being disloyal to our families. And I always talk about adoption as being like in social work. So anybody who's familiar with social work, when we think about the micro, the meso, and the macro, families are that kind of micro. It's our relationships with our family members. And it's really hard for anybody to think, oh, I can really love my parents and my family and feel like I had a strong, safe childhood and yet be completely critical of the larger macro systems that created that and
yeah.
the impact that it has. So we're not seeing very often transracial families where the parents are making the decision to live in the communities where their adopted child is from. We're not seeing scenarios where they're putting themselves to be highlighted as the other so that the child can grow up in community. It's almost always the other way around. And what that does is as we grow up, we're confronted with this whole who are we?
Mm,
When there's a part of us that feels so culturally identified with our adoptive families, but as adults in the world, we're seen as part of our communities of origin, and they don't understand us and we don't understand them. So it's really challenging for transracial adoptees. A lot of my work really is built on that experience. But again, I'm a latecomer to that. I
Yeah.
didn't start to think about those things really seriously until I was almost in my 30s.
You mentioned that you felt freer to explore without your family around. And then there was a dynamic that you named. The setup was inherently set up to where, and I'm paraphrasing, but you said doing so would seem as if you were, was it betraying your
Disloyal.
family's attorney? Disloyal,
Yes.
being disloyal to your
Yes.
family. Could you share more about that setup and how you experienced that?
Yeah. You're a parent. I'm a parent too.
Hmm.
And I don't expect my kids to ever feel like if they have a different way of being or thinking about things, that it's hurting my feelings.
Yeah.
I may not like what they have to say or what they think or their views, but I don't feel personally offended by their views.
Hmm.
But when it comes to adoption, because adoption is so messy, it's oftentimes, this is just the way it is. Parents who are adopting oftentimes are coming from it from two different main reasons. There's multiple reasons, of course, but oftentimes it's because of infertility or because they, in some ways, have tried to have children by birth and haven't. They may be coming from a place already of their own hurt and
Hmm.
their own desire to parent and things not working out the way they had planned.
Yeah.
Well, in some cases, we're plan B. We're the backup option if they can't have kids by birth. Then another kind of large reason that families might adopt is because they have this idea of wanting to save a child or rescue a child who comes from abuse, neglect, poverty, whatever.
Hmm.
And in both of those cases, unintentionally, I think adoptive parents can give the sense that we owe them something
Yeah.
as children. That I think that children who are ours by birth typically don't have that same sense of expectation that they owe us something. And that if we critique adoption or say things like, I wish I'd been raised in Korea or with a Korean family or in a more diverse area, then it's seen as attacking them
Hmm.
and they might be offended personally.
Hmm.
And so we see this dynamic. And part of that really is because social workers, up until maybe the last decade or two, really pushed this idea of assimilating kids of color into white families
Let's
and
talk about it.
treating them as if they were just white. And we all hear the term color blindness a lot. I choose to use the term color evasive.
Mm.
And my friend and scholar, Subani Animal, who's at Stanford, who's also happens to be a transracial adoptee, but does work around disability and incarceration of juveniles, especially girls. She writes about color evasiveness as being, it's not just that people don't see color, it's that they're avoiding seeing color. It's they actually are avoiding talking about it, confronting it, wanting to grapple with it. And so it's really more of a mechanism of evasiveness than it
Yeah.
is just not seeing it. Because they see us, right?
Because they
Yeah,
see us.
they see us. They just don't want to acknowledge it. And
Mm.
so that's the difference between color evasiveness versus color blindness. Although I just think of Eduardo Bonilla Silva's seminal book on it, the mechanisms are still very similar. I think the discourse around it, I really relate to a lot. I read that book and I was like, yeah, this is my life. All these white people just choosing not to acknowledge and saying these really racist and problematic things in my own family, in my neighborhood, my friends growing up, because they didn't acknowledge that I was a person of color.
Evasiveness. There's evasiveness and explain. And then when I hear you describe that, it's also the question of what would then the acknowledgement of that mean for me as a white person? What kind of questions would I have to ask of myself and everything? And
Oh,
so that
no.
evasiveness is like, oh, I really just don't want to ask all this stuff. Thinking about like cognitive dissonance and all that. I just, oh,
Totally. Yeah, the cognitive dissonance. There's an element, I think, of knowing this is going to come, like you said, the questions that they would have to ask themselves, like, why did I take a child out of their racial and cultural, ethnic origins and move them to a place where they weren't going to be around any other people that looked like them, that spoke their language? Me, coming from Korea, I had to relearn a new language. I had to experience a cognitive dissonance in which I had to now think, oh, these people that don't look anything like me, that don't speak my language, that don't have any of my cultural customs are now the people that I'm supposed to identify as being like my primary family.
Mm.
No acknowledgement that I had a family somewhere in Korea that I don't know and still to this day don't know. And not only that, but by taking me out of it so completely, it made me a stranger to my own ethnic community. And so then there's all this reverse work that we have to do to try and deal with our own internalized racism and oppression and ethnocentrism, because I was raised to think that white people were superior
Yeah.
and white people knew everything. So I didn't even realize that 20 minutes from me, there were Korean churches and Korean restaurants and Korean grocery stores. Minnesota doesn't have a huge Korean population, but there is one. And yet I was never in any of those spaces until I became an adult and found them on my own.
You also talked about in terms of one of those pivotal moments or experiences, becoming an adult, but then also becoming a parent. You're teaching in social work. I teach in social work too. One of the things that I often pull from is that cycle of socialization and talking about those early experiences we get and how it forms, how we feel about ourselves, the messages we get that say we're inferior depending on our identities,
Yeah.
and messages we get that tells us we're superior, and how those messages are like reinforced in systems and the things that we have to interact with. I remember talking with students, and they're in some of my courses on social justice education. And sometimes at the end of that, as early as that first semester, then they're having some new things to think about as they leave, and then go back to sometimes those breaks and holidays, go back to families, communities sometimes that have not changed in the ways that they have. And then that sets off other sets of experiences about what do I do with this information? Do I challenge it, or the ways that we make those decisions? And so for many years, I would teach about that and talk about that. But I will say, becoming a parent, it makes me look at it in a very different way, because that's one of the things I would talk about from an early age. We're taught by the folks who raise us, who care about us, these different messages. And so, oh, okay, so I have messages now too. And so it made me think of that experience in some way when you shared in preparation for this, just thinking about a pivotal experience being becoming a parent yourself.
Yeah. Because I grew up without any acknowledgement of my Korean identity or my racial identity as an Asian American. And my parents are like a lot of, kind of good intention, but they weren't educated on the language and how to talk about it. And they were actively encouraged not to. Their social workers and other people encouraged them not to talk about race and not to talk about difference because it was seen as if maybe that would be more harmful to point
Hmm.
out that I was different. So as a result, I didn't know how to talk about race at all. I didn't know how to talk about any kinds of social justice issues. And then when I had my kids, and I was a younger parent, I was 25 when I had my daughter. And it really struck me like, oh, I'm raising kids of color, which until then, I really hadn't fully embraced myself as a person of color. I was just starting to do that and seeing myself as Asian American. And then I realized I have these two kids who are both Asian American too. And because I'm in an interracial relationship, my husband is white. So my kids actually look very ethnically ambiguous. People don't always notice that they're Asian. And I wanted them to have the language that I didn't have to talk about my experiences. As a kid of color in a predominantly white school, I was bullied a lot because of my race.
Mm.
And I would go home and I would tell my parents, oh, I got teased. People were pulling back the corners of their eyes. They were doing these sing song rhymes like Chinese, Japanese, dirty knees, look at these. They would call me racial slurs, but I didn't know what those things really meant. But I just knew it made me feel bad. Right.
Hmm.
So I would
Yeah.
go home and I would share these experiences, and my parents didn't know how to talk about it. So their response was everybody gets teased for something. And
Yeah.
the danger of that is I didn't know how to identify racism. I didn't know how to identify these microaggressions outright. And so I would just suppress it. I would ignore it. You develop these coping mechanisms. But I didn't want my kids to have to go through that because a family's job, a parent's job is to protect their child and to be that safe place for them. And if my kids are being bullied in school because of their race, I want them to come to me and let me know. I want to be able to, first of all, validate them. And then second of all, explain what's happening and why it's happening, and then
Yeah.
help problem solve together. How do we handle this? You can ignore it. You can walk away. You can confront them. I can come in as the adult and talk to the school, the different options, but letting them know that there are options,
Hmm.
not just suppressing it and feeling like, oh, it's just me. And I started very simply. Our kids consume a lot of media. And so I would just use those opportunities when we're reading books or when we were watching videos or movies or TV shows. I would watch it with them and then I would just narrate and comment when I would see certain dynamics. Oh, do you notice how this is happening? This white girl in this Disney TV show has the one friend who's black, but she's always the wisecracking jokester. She's never like, why, where are the black kids that are the feature of the show? Why is
That's
it
right.
always that they're the sidekick? And it really did help. My kids grew up having that language and being able to decide how they were going to respond to things. And then also critically analyze media, which
Mm.
I think is so huge. Our kids really are bombarded with media and they need to know what they're watching and to be able to critique it. And so I was really intentional in trying to do that from a very young age, not just about race, but also about gender identity, about queerness, about all the different ways that people are different.
Yes.
And not to say that I'm like some perfect parent at all, but I just wanted to have these conversations with them. And now that they're adults, they're 26 and 30, we can have these conversations. Like when we get together, we do these virtual dinners because they're still in Minnesota. We will have these conversations where they will talk about musicians or movies that they're seeing or what's happening in their communities, and we can totally have these conversations about it. And I feel like that was because I was really trying to be intentional in raising them differently than how I was raised, so that they could feel free to speak up.
That's right. That's right. That's right. And even you describing some of the things you do, I believe will also help other folks out there who are wondering, like, okay, what are some of the things that I can do? And I love how you told that story, showing your children and the degrees that we can show our children that there are options other than, as you said, ignoring it and then there are also other options than recognizing or feeling as if you have to navigate it by yourself. So I really
Yeah.
appreciate how, and like you said, it's not perfect, but I appreciate how you laid out some of the things that you do because I believe even in sharing that will help other folks as well.
Let me just give you, if it's okay,
Yeah, go
how.
for it.
So my husband said to me, one of these days, the way you teach your kids about critical civil disobedience is going to turn around and bite us. But this is an example of how our kids can be our teachers too. We talked a lot about Indigenous, First Nations, Native American rights and the way they were discriminated against. And my parents are really big on the holidays, and my mom does Thanksgiving, and a lot of white parents wanted to do this whole story about the first Thanksgiving with the Pilgrims and the
Oh,
Indians that was all
yes.
very sanitized. And she wanted my daughter, who was 12 at the time, to read this at Thanksgiving dinner. And my daughter looked at it and said, I don't want to read this because this isn't accurate. And
Yeah.
and here's where I, as a parent, failed. I had said, just make grandma happy. I know this isn't accurate, but just read it and we know it's not true. And she said, why do we always have to change us? Why can't they change their behavior? Why do we always have to change it? And it was
Hmm.
one of those moments where I was really confronted with, I can talk the talk, but I'm not always walking the talk.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
so here, my 12-year-old reminded me that I was trying to placate white people and just sanitize the truth.
Yeah.
And that was a real lesson for me.
Yeah, that's an important lesson. And even just recognizing that, yeah, that process isn't always going to be perfect, but the lessons that you are sharing and passing on are getting through to the degree that they're using them. And you know what? You didn't say it, but I also say, hey, schools of social work, other institutions
Yeah.
across the country where students are using the tools of organizing, they're using the education that they are getting to then respond to what they're seeing in the world. And so I think even in that example that you gave, I think there are lessons there that we can take from our own individual, interpersonal experiences. But I also think institutions can take something from what you shared too in terms of their responses, because I think there are lots of examples of that. We're just doing what you all have
What we taught
taught
you.
us and trained us to do. And
Yeah.
it's just, I hope that lands where it needs to for folks who need to hear that as well. So you also said, okay, so there was a point in your life where you didn't, because of your upbringing, the ways that you were socialized, you didn't necessarily know how to name and recognize racism in ways. And so, what are some experiences that you had that took you from that place to then now you're able to recognize racism? You're able to, some ways, honor and trust your own, gut when you know what's happening within you. What took you from not being able to recognize it to now you can recognize it, and then later on you're sharing it and translating these lessons to your own kids?
Yeah. I A lot of these things happened all at the same time. I would say my late 20s, early 30s were really this a period of tremendous change and growth. When I was 30, I reconnected with the only Korean adoptee friend I'd ever had in childhood. We had met at a church camp when we were in like first or second or grade or something. And I was just starting to again think, oh, I've got kids and they're half Korean, and how am I going to help them not be scared of Korean culture the way I was.
Mm.
And so I was starting to learn how to cook Korean food. And so that meant going to like Korean grocery stores or Asian markets. And I just happened to come across this publication called Korean Quarterly, and I brought it home and I opened it up, and there was this essay by this person who there were enough clues in her essay that I was like, I think that might be the person that I'd met.
Oh.
And she had an email there, and she had started doing some organizing in kind of central Minnesota, which is pretty rural, and other Korean adoptees. She was going through the same thing. And I was like, oh, she's also really reckoning with this identity stuff too. And she also had young kids about the same age as me. So we reconnected, and she had just decided she was going to go to Korea, and she invited me to go along with her. And so we went. And so it was like meeting other Korean adoptees and going to Korea for the first time. In my mind, I don't think I ever thought that I would get a chance to go to Korea and see the place where I was born. And
Mhm.
so that was really significant. But both of these things, when I came home from Korea, it was just this huge identity crisis for me. And a couple of years later, I was a college dropout. That's the other thing I didn't talk about. But I had gone to college, and I talked about how that was the time when I had the freedom to explore my racial identity. But I was a really not great student. So I didn't know what I wanted to do. And I kept transferring schools and dropping out. And so I had just decided I'm taking a break. But something really, I was doing some volunteer work, and those folks that I was working with in the volunteer program suggested social work as a potential pathway for me. And I was 32, 33-ish. And they said, you should look it up. So I found a program, and it was that BSW program
Mhm.
at this small college. It was a public university, and it was a small program where every single faculty in that program were people of color. And wow, like I started that
Yeah.
program,
Wow.
and that's where I learned all this language. But I will say it's a unique program because when I tell people, oh, yeah, my instructors were Latino women, Latino men, African American, Hmong, and Native American, they're just like, what social work program were
Yeah.
you in?
I'm saying that a little bit.
No, it was unique. I don't think I even understood the gravity of how unique and special that was. And they had intentionally set up their program so that the first year we were all in community organizations. So I was an African American adoption agency, and people were at like an Asian American place or Division of Indian Works or working with the Latino population. And the first internship, for folks who don't know social work, you do an internship, but usually it's like in your undergrad, you do one for a year.
Mhm.
We had two of them. And the first year we're in these community organizations where it wasn't just the clients that were from that racial or ethnic group. It was also all the caseworkers and the administrators. So we got a really different view, a vantage of what social services could look like. And
Wow.
then our second internship was in a quote unquote traditional agency. And so what we saw really quickly was like the difference between how people of color run their organizations and their services versus white dominated agencies. And I learned so much in that program. And that's where I thrived for the first time ever.
Mm.
I got good grades. I was really engaged in the coursework and loved my internship experiences and was encouraged by my faculty. They saw something in me and said, you should go on to get your master's. And again, coming from somebody who my parents hadn't gone to college, I had a very I don't know exactly the right word to say. Is I just felt like I was wandering and I didn't know what I wanted to do. And so my college pathway was not effective. I see a lot of people, like a lot of my students have the same experiences. They don't know what they want to do, but they feel like they're supposed to go to college. So they go and
Yeah.
then they struggle. Once I figured out social work was the right pathway for me, and I was so influenced by having faculty of color and like having an Asian instructor, having a Native American, it's like, it was really mind blowing. I went on to my master's program and kind of similar experiences in my internships. I went to the flagship program at the land grant university, and there were two faculty of color in the whole program. It was a huge program. And so again, it was
Yeah.
like,
Seeing that contrast.
seeing the contrast. And I think my activism kind of really started around that time. So I started a student of color social work organization. Do you remember the film Crash
I do.
that
I
won the
do.
Academy
I
Award?
sure do. Yep.
So I
I
had
sure
seen the
do.
film and I hated it, and I had all kinds of critiques about it. And my
Mhm.
social work student organization in my MSW program, they wanted to have the film shown and have a discussion about it. And I wanted to have a discussion about it, but not that discussion that I thought was going to happen
Yeah.
in this space with the white students.
Yeah.
So I actually appealed to a graduate student, a PhD student who was Black, and the dean, and said, would you help me? Could we watch this film, but have it only students of color watch the film? And that kind of started the Student of Color organization. So I was
Yeah.
starting at that point to put everything together. I started my blog around the same time.
Wow,
And so
okay,
you
so
could really see
this is
how,
good history that we're getting. Okay, yeah.
yeah. So this is around 2006. And I
Okay.
think I felt like I could now translate all the things I'd learned in my bachelor's of social work program at this really amazing school that I went to and start using it because I was like, I didn't know any of this stuff. This is where I learned about Native American boarding schools and orphan trains and
Yes.
the Multi Ethnic Placement Act, all these things that really harmed children of color. And that's where I were able to connect the dots to my own personal experience to these larger projects and systems
Mhm.
and be like, oh, the United States has a long-standing history of trying to separate kids that they think are from problematic communities, whether it's immigrant communities or whatever, and trying to either assimilate us, as one way of removing us from that identity. Because it's powerful when you raise children to hate their own communities.
Ye
And people oftentimes are like, adoption isn't like it's not trying to do that. But I think actually it is. The Indian Adoption Project was a Children's Bureau and Bureau of Indian Affairs project that intentionally was trying to remove children, place them in white adoptive homes, Native children, because they wanted them to be assimilated. And
Mhm.
there's all these. So I feel like when you destroy families of color, you destroy their communities. And I do think that's an intentional act.
Yeah,
And when you couch it in adoption, it makes it harder to critique, but it doesn't mean that the intention's not still there.
that's right. The intention and the design. When you mentioned Crash, it just took me way back because, yeah, it was one of those things that even when I was in grad school, it was something that I was shown. And there's going to be another episode that comes out with a classmate of mine from that time. And we're just reflecting on some things that were happening and the need to have conversations structured in a way like how you described it, because you already know what kind of conversation that was going to be about. And we know the impact that was going to have if we didn't do some kind of caucusing with that discussion.
Hmm.
So I appreciate you sharing that story. So you've had those earlier experiences and didn't know how to recognize racism at one time, got into your social work program. Speaking of design, that contrast, starting out your field placement and the differences in organizations and seeing how what impact did even that shift or the things that you were noticing, what impact did that have on you? And then how are you carrying those earlier experiences into the work that you do now? As you shared that, I'm like, this is the thing. Like, you're right. Most folks they'll just do the one, but I loved how you described that. You had a chance to experience multiple settings and see the differences and how they play out.
Greatest lesson that I learned from being in my BSW program was that people of color are competent leaders in finding and directing healing for our own communities. And that's a lesson that the history of social work doesn't teach us.
Mhm.
The history of social work is white, very well educated, and wealthy people are the ones who help save and rescue us, people of color. And my experiences in my undergrad social work program was like, nope, that's not true. We can take care of ourselves. And in fact, we know best what our communities need.
Mhm.
And so I think that allowed me to develop a critical voice and the ability to be able to push back a little bit when other people want to portray this dominant view of, oh, we just need rescuing and saving. We don't know what we're doing. All the pathological things you hear in politics today about communities of color
Yeah.
come from these really deficit frameworks. Instead of people saying, wow, despite all the hundreds of years of attempted genocide and erasure, we're still here
Still here.
and we are still taking care of our folks. And that's really profound. And I think that a lot of people don't really recognize that. It's what really drives me today in my work is being like, no, man, like I like films, okay? It's the film A Bug's Life.
Yeah.
There's a scene where the ants and the grasshoppers are saying, we can't let them know that there's more of them than there are us. Like,
Yes.
they don't want us to know our own power. And so I'm all about trying to help people understand, like, you have power, but it's not individual power, which is like what supremacy wants us to believe. It's power in our communities. It's power through communities.
Mhm.
And so I'm trying to help, in my case, it's transracial adoptees understand if we can join together and work together, then we can make some great changes. But if we think that we're just going to be individual leaders, then we're just buying into the white supremacy model. One of the things I've been saying lately in my communities, talking to adoption agencies and child welfare organizations, is that the systems that harmed us as people of color, as transracially adopted kids in the foster care system who are largely youth of color, those systems that harm us can't be the systems that heal us. That
Mm.
those of us who experience these different things, when we put together programs and services, we do a better job of meeting the needs of our communities. And so, what I am now starting to ask organizations is instead of you developing your own post adoption services for adopt, why not just fund those of us that are already doing that work and then we'll do it?
Yeah.
Like they got
Yeah.
the money, so they can fund us because we're doing a good job. We just don't have enough funding. We don't have enough respect. It's like the agencies want to do it. If they really believe and say they're committed to valuing our experiences, then they can value us by helping to support us financially, which
That's
is
right.
one of the most biggest challenges, that we have in doing our community work.
It reminds me of things I often hear, like folks of color are over mentored, but underfunded though. Like you said, we
Oh,
know
yeah.
what we need. We're already doing a good job. What we need is actually the resources, right? And
Right.
there's all this history and policy and reasons why we don't have the resources that we need, but we know, given the right resources, we know exactly what we would do. We know how we would go about solving the problems that we're facing.
Yeah, I mean, don't you think I've noticed, at least in the child welfare sphere, there's been this real push for a while to have people with quote unquote lived experience join advisory boards or be on the board of directors in a kind of limited token role, or we'll start a program and we'll hire somebody with lived experience to be part of it. But it's always like an add-on to their main programming. Again, I feel like it's going to be so limited. Why not just say, yeah, that's not my business, so to speak.
Yeah.
Let's hand it off to the people who really can do it.
Imagine what this world, what our institutions, what our systems would look like. Yes, yes. Just
Yeah.
owning, no, we actually don't have the solutions to this, but we know who does. You all do. And so here you go. Here you go. Here you go.
And it's a challenge for funders too, because I want those different organizations that do funding for different social service organizations to be more thoughtful and think more creatively about the projects that they're going to fund and how they're going to support people. So, like, we might need some extra support in training on how to manage big budgets and do that sort of thing, but then let us do that.
Yeah,
Right. So don't just say, I'll hire you to be a program director, but we're going to control the resources. We need to learn how to do it.
that's right.
And it's the long game too. These projects are often funded for 3 years and then they want you to figure out how to sustain your program.
Hmm.
We're not getting help in figuring out how to be sustained for more than the 3-year project demonstration
Right. That's
funding that
right.
we're getting.
That's right. And if you're leading with that kind of a time frame, how can you project? How can you be visionary? How can you take that time to actually map things out when that is such a short time frame? It's like you're pretty much just handling some folks, everybody navigates is different, but I think the impact of that short time frame is like you're pretty much just handling things as they come, what's in front of you in
Mhm.
some ways. And yeah, that funding is very important in terms of providing even more than that. Folks need staff, folks need there's a variety of different resources, and that's a really short
Right.
window. Mhm.
Yeah.
What or who has shaped your analysis and actions and how you use yourself in your work? It could be people, books, movements, experiences that have been significant, folks who've shaped your analysis or things that have shaped your analysis along the way.
Definitely the faculty that were on the social work program in my undergraduate program were hugely influential because it was through those classes that I really learned the language and the understanding the broader macro view of all these things that I had observed, but didn't know how to describe or didn't know how to even really fully think and critique them. So they helped me do that. I had a professor who is a transracial adoptee, Robert O'Connor, and grew up, was in the foster care system, was eventually adopted by a white family. And I just looked up to him and was able to see, you know, what he had accomplished. And because our stories are different, but our trajectories are similar, if that makes
Mhm.
sense.
Yeah.
So having that role model and being able to have that support from somebody else who had walked that path was really helpful. And then I had other bosses at places that I worked that believed in me and helped me learn. But I would really say the biggest, it's been the community. And I've tried really intentionally to be part of a community, even as I've gone through more of this formal academics, because academia is a weird space and they are so talked about creativity, but sometimes I think there's a real lack of creativity in higher education and especially in research.
Mhm.
And there's this idea again of like, we're the experts and we're going to come into a community and we're going to study you to tell you what your problems are and what we think should be done. At least this is in social work research. And for me, I was like, no, that's actually the opposite. We should be going into the community because we're part of the community. We listen to what they say. We engage with the community. They tell us this is what we need. This is what we want to study. And then you have the skills to be able to do that study. And then you bring it back to the community and you
Yeah.
say, what do you think? Is this reflect what you thought? And they say yay or nay. and then you adapt, and then it has to be accessible to our communities. So if we're doing research and only publishing in academic journals and not presenting it back to the community, then they don't know what's being said or done. Even things like, here are some terms that we use in academia, and they say, I don't know what that means. Because in our community, we don't use that word. We
Hmm.
don't use that term. And then, so are we reflecting the way our community is talking about things? I feel like it's such a privilege for me to have this educational background and the job where I can do this kind of work, because I go into the communities and I told them this is really meant to empower you. It's not just about me coming in and saying, this is what I think we should be talking about. And I want them to have the language. I want them to have access to the research, because they don't know what's been said or done about our community. And
Hmm.
I don't know. It's just, I feel like academic folks are always saying, when they hear things that are happening in our communities, they say that's just anecdotal. And so
Right.
I feel like part of my job is, one, to elevate that into research. So when you do a qualitative study, it's not just anecdotal anymore. Now there's evidence. And so it's about, like, how do we leverage the critiques that
Yeah.
people are saying about our communities in order to legitimize it? Because the stories are legitimate too, but some people will only hear the research. And
That's
so
right.
how can we do that?
Yeah, and the way you even describe relating to folks in communities who are sharing the information that informs that research, it's like, all right, yeah, we talk, and then we go back and say, okay, this is what we've heard. Is this reflective? And the degrees that folks sometimes will share, actually, no, we don't use that word. And honoring what they're sharing, that kind of a relationship chips away at what I think, and I've experienced too in my own work, when relating to folks in communities, their deep and intimate understanding of how some institutions of higher education have had exploitative relationships with the communities in
Yeah.
which they are living in and the folks living around them. It's no, I don't trust y'all because again, like you're picking up something that's actually not what we said, that's not reflective, is reinforcing some other kind of narrative. And sharing and relating to folks in the way that you described, I think is a great way to bring about some equity in that relationship. It's like we want this to be informed. It's about you. It's supposed to, like you said, it's supposed to empower you. We want our findings, the storytelling that comes out of this to be reflective of what you have shared with us. And it's like honoring the people and not exploiting them, that sort of thing. So appreciate you sharing that piece about your experiences. So, the folks that you've named, the community as a group, you mentioned a couple of folks along your educational journey too, others. What would you say to them or about them? What comes to mind that you would say to them or about them in terms of just speaking to the impact that your experience with them has had on you in your life?
We all get to where we are because of the people in our lives who have believed in us. And so part of what I would just say is, like, it's so important for any of us doing our work to be mindful of the people that are coming up behind us too. So now I'm at the point where I'm in my mid 50s, and I'm in a position of power and privilege. I'm a professor, I have a PhD, I have resources to be able to do my work. And there's a lot of other people who were like me 20 years ago, still trying to figure out their path. And so I really take it to heart. I very much believe at my core that a part of my work means finding ways to bring up other people and to mentor them, or to help find resources for them, or even just be a sounding board for their projects and to encourage and to pay it back. I feel like I was helped a lot by people who had that power and privilege at one point.
Yeah.
They took me under their wing, and I'm now trying to encourage other people. You can do it too. And in fact, the world's ready for you. There's room for all of us to do this work. And I'm encouraged by the number of more people with lived experience who are entering these spaces now and really doing some amazing work.
I think that connects well to our next question. What do you hope listeners will learn or take away from your story, and what actions would you encourage them to take?
First of all, I think a lot of people still have a lot of misconceptions around transracial adoption. And I think it's because of the adoption part. And thinking, oh, it's just such a good thing that people do. I think people don't understand that with adoption comes loss and trauma,
Mm,
that families are made only because other families fell apart in one way or another or were separated intentionally. For whatever reason, however, a family is broken up, adoption doesn't cure that for them. Adoption can be a place where a child can get some stability and some love, but it doesn't mean that their families of origin didn't love them. It doesn't mean that they weren't loved in their communities. And especially when race is involved and there's a transracial or transnational adoption that happens, I think people don't realize the extent to the losses that occur.
mm,
So for one thing, stop just using adoption as a joke or saying things like, oh, that person is so great. I wish they would adopt me and things like that, because it really diminishes that sense of loss. And the other thing I want listeners to take away is that those of us with lived experience in our communities are experts in our experience and that we should be treated as such and validated for what we can contribute. And that doesn't mean that you have to have a PhD to do that. Like, I think I had a social worker once tell me, just because you were adopted doesn't make you an expert in adoption. And that just really was
mm.
upsetting because I may not be an expert in adoption policies or in adoption practice, but I was an expert in my lived experience.
Oh, yeah.
Right. And instead of saying, how can we help you put that experience into context, it was just a shutdown. I think I'm seeing an improvement in people with lived experiences like mine being given space. There's room for improvement.
It was just a shutdown. And then the way you described that, it took me back to earlier point in your sharing around, again, talking and speaking to institutions. It's naming inequity, naming a problem isn't creating a problem. It is surfacing what is already there that, the structures are not taken into account or not paying attention to. And so this idea of even oh, you're not an expert in what was the end game of that? Not you actually answering that, but I'm thinking even those various attempts to silence the voices of the people who are trying to tell us something are going back to this. What would it mean then for me to actually acknowledge this lived experience? What would it mean about how I feel about my institution? All the things I've been taught about my institution. And as you're sharing that, and as folks are listening to that too, just think about all the ways that defensiveness, that, those, both from the perspective of people out there who have been shut down, but then also from the folks, if you find yourself doing the shutting down, ask yourself, wait a minute, where is this defensiveness coming from? And what do I need to, how can I recenter myself and make a different decision? Because for me, it goes back to, I remember you saying like I'm paraphrasing, but to the degree you're exploring, you're naming other things, feels like this sense of being disloyal. And it's, wait a minute, I've talked with other folks it is because I am a part of these systems or that I interact with these things that, I can criticize it. I can say we should be open to those things. So thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. So I have some finish the statement questions. So I have three of them.
Well,
Just finish the
okay.
statement. I'll say a thing, and then you just say whatever comes to your mind. Okay. Finish this statement. True social justice is possible when.
Oh, what a good statement. Okay. True social justice is possible when people who have power are willing to give it up for the communities to make decisions about their own lives.
My approach to social justice is shaped by.
My approach to social justice is shaped by being part of a community who is trying to make a difference and reshape the way we think about child welfare and adoption.
Understanding and sharing our social justice origin stories is important because.
Oh, it's important because without other people seeing how other people have done things, they may not know what's possible for themselves.
Mhm. And our last question, I am hoping that these stories, these narratives, the sharing will exist for many years to come. I'll just say, even beyond our time is what my hope is. And for future generations who would come across this recording, is there anything you'd like them to know, anything you'd like to pass to them?
Like them to know that there is a history of people who have been working in these areas, that there's been a long lineage of, as you put it, resistors and people who have been critiquing the system and trying to make changes. And it is all of our responsibilities to learn from our teachers, those who have done this work, and then put our own unique spin on it and pay it forward to the next generations.
JaeRan Kim. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. JaeRan Kim, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts and subscribe to Social Justice Origin Stories there or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also watch video episodes on YouTube at Social Justice Origin Stories, and I'd really appreciate it if you subscribe there as well. Video episodes are also available on the project website, socialjusticeoriginstories.com. Follow the project on Instagram at Social Justice Origin Stories. I'd love to hear about how you're engaging with the stories. Share your thoughts at socialjusticeoriginstories.com/contact or by emailing stories@socialjusticeoriginstories.com. To support the work of Social Justice Origin Stories, consider becoming a monthly patron. Your contributions will help keep this research going and support its mission. Visit patreon.com/socialjusticeoriginstories to learn more and to make a contribution. Again, that's patreon.com/Social Justice Origin Stories. You can start or stop anytime. Social Justice Origin Stories is edited, hosted, and produced by me, Rolando Tompkins Jones. Many thanks to our storyteller this week and the many storytellers who have contributed to this project. And thank you for joining me this week. Take care.